The next speaker is a graduate of the University of Toronto Medical School, which is near and dear to us since our parent company is located in Toronto. He did his residency at Bay State Medical Center, affiliated with Tufts University, did his fellowship at Geneva Children's Hospital, and then the Hospital for Sick Kids, also in Toronto, another place near and dear to Dr. Norris Carroll, who practiced at Sick Kids before he practiced at then Chicago Children's, now Lurie Children's. This speaker is currently at Rush University Children's Hospital. He's a neonatologist. He's the assistant professor of pediatrics and neonatology and the director of newborn transport. He's also board certified by the American Board of Pediatrics, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Powell.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. So a little bit of what I'm going to show you is going to be deja vu after the last talk. And so I'm going to try to skip over some of those things and focus more on things that we did. So just as an outline, I'm going to go a little bit over the background about alarm management and talk about what our goals were, and really our choosing a vendor, choosing middleware, how we designed the architecture and configuration, and then did some test, some simulation, and a little bit of what our results are, and then I'll talk a little bit about alarm fatigue and some of the conclusions. Okay, so a little bit about the background. So newborn intensive care is constantly evolving, and the old model was really developed in the 70s and 80s when the focus was on survival, and there was a huge increase in survival among premature babies at that time. But unfortunately, that meant that these babies ended up spending long periods in the hospital, and so there's a huge swelling of the patient's census. And instead of babies living for just days to weeks, they were living for months, and the NICUs grew and grew. And so many units just blossomed during that time, and because space was cramped and they expanded, we ended up in these large ward-style NICUs with many babies in large rooms. And you saw some of the pictures there before. And then around 2000 was the beginning of this trend to move away from that model. And many units started early with single patient rooms, and now it seems that almost every new unit that's being built these days is a single patient model. And probably that's been true for the last 5 years or so. And why did that happen? Well, the goals were to decrease noise and stimulation. I think that was probably the biggest one. But also to allow for family-centered care. It's hard for parents to stay over when you have just baby after baby along the wall. There's a known reduction in nosocomial infections that was well studied in the adult population during that same thing that happened as we moved from ward-style ICUs to single patient rooms. And also for allowing for privacy. And you heard before about this issue about HIPAA, and it's a big problem rounding in the NICU where you have multiple parents and you're talking about sensitive issues, whether it's drug use, HIV, and other types of infections. So it made it more difficult to be able to really have frank discussions with families there. So as I said, the majority of NICUs have adopted this model, and I don't know of any new NICUs that have been opening in the last few years that have not been used. So the problem was, for us, we were moving from an open bay NICU environment to a single patient room, and in the open bay, nurses heavily rely on line of sight to physiologic monitoring. And this concept of line of sight to patients is something that was really fundamental to the way that nurses practice. All of the workflows depended on communication. If you needed help, you just yelled, help. You didn't need, staff assist or staff emergency buttons. One nurse could be in a room, a large room, and monitor multiple babies. So multiple babies could be monitored by a single nurse just by looking around the room and seeing the alarm from across the room, seeing the monitor, and saying, "Oh, I don't need to get to that right away. I'll get over there in a few minutes." So we moved to a single patient room. Babies are spread over a much larger area. There's really no line of sight, and certainly in our design, we have less line of sight than in the unit you just saw. Alarms can't be heard outside of the patient room, especially if the doors are closed. There's really no direct communication between staff because the staff are primarily in the rooms taking care of the patients, so they don't see each other. They can't talk to each other the way they used to. And there's just absolutely no awareness of what's going on with the other patients. So if you're in a room, you're with your patient, you may have one or two other patients down the hall, and there are other people who may be away on break that you're covering, and you just have no awareness about what's going on with them. So this is our old NICU. You can see they're really similar to what you just saw. The beds are cramped. We used to round right at the bedside. And This is what our new unit looks like, and they're all single patient rooms. This is the rooms, what they look like from the hallway. So it's a very different change in workflow. We have 72 beds in our new unit. We went from 57 to 72 when we expanded, and we divided them into 3 pods or neighborhoods, each with 24 beds. And so to try to create almost separate units. We didn't quite open all of the beds when we first opened. So the first thing we really looked at were workflows and how workflows would be impacted by this whole process. And we decided that for workflows to work, the existing workflows to work, the nurses had to be able to receive alerts both from the patient systems and from other staff because they couldn't do that the way they were before. The alerts had to be assigned priority to differentiate them so that, you know, if the family member wants a cup of water versus the patient having a bradycardia, we needed a way to differentiate between those. And we needed to have an escalation process so that if someone was busy or couldn't get to it or just didn't respond or their phone fell on the floor and broke, that someone else would be able to respond on a timely basis. So alarm fatigue is something that has been talked about more and more over the last couple of years. When we first planned the design, no one really thought about alarm fatigue. And alarm fatigue is overexposure to alarms that can result in ignoring critically important alarms. And devices at the bedside have really grown in the last number of years. So we not only have vital sign monitors and ventilators, infusion pumps, pulse oximeters, feeding pumps, capnographs, there are all kinds of other devices that are often used at the bedside if you have complicated ICU patients on ECMO, dialysis. All of these other pieces of equipment all make noise when there's something wrong, and so it doesn't take long before you're generating hundreds and hundreds of alarms per patient per day, and staff get overloaded. You just heard about the whole Joint Commission guidelines. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, about the Equity Institute that rated patient alarm fatigue as the top of a list of patient safety threats. So the problem with alarm fatigue is it's a little bit of the boy who cried wolf. You want to know about things, but you want to know about useful information. If you keep hearing alarms, you eventually ignore them and don't do anything. So from a management or supervising role, you want everything to go to the nurses. You want them to get every single alarm. And this is actually how we originally did our design. We thought we want to know about everything that happens. If it alarms in the room, it's probably important enough that someone should know. Otherwise, why is it alarming in the room? And this is a fundamental problem we have. What do we do with all of these alarms that are alarming in the room that we don't care about or want to know about? Why can't we turn those off? The nurses, on the other hand, they don't want all those alarms. They're already overloaded. They get too many. And as we talk about, we only have middleware in the NICU in our hospital. And as I talk to nurses from other parts of the hospital, they always say, I don't want any more stuff going to my phone. I already get too many phone calls as it is. I wish I could throw my phone away. So they don't want to know about them. They want to just be able to know, okay, my patient's over there, the monitor's on, and I can listen closely and pay attention. So in this process, we came up with a hypothesis that this disconnecting communication and line of sight in moving to single patient rooms can be mitigated, and mitigated primarily with technology. And by implementing an alarm management system to integrate with, we started off just with physiological monitors, ventilators, and the nurse call system, going to wireless phones, that we can successfully make the transition from open bay to single patient environments while maintaining safety and minimizing alarm fatigue. And so that was really what we set out to do in this project. And these are very subjective goals. They're not easy to measure. And how do you define maintaining safety and minimizing alarm fatigue? And that's been one of the difficulties. So we wanted to create a system for managing the alarms that had a high degree of alarm specificity. And this was really important for us. We already have a nurse call system that can send alarms, send information to the phones. The problem is everything is the same sound. It's all a phone call that rings, and you don't know, is that the patient who wants a drink of water or something more serious, a code blue. All of those go to the phone as a phone call that you have to actually answer before you can find out what it is. So we really were not happy with that kind of model. We wanted to have alarm specificity where every alarm type, we could clearly define what the escalation patterns were, who it was going to, and what the sounds were. And we called this creating a virtual line of sight. So we wanted to develop a strategy to minimize alarm fatigue because we were aware that that would be a problem. We needed to configure and test the systems as part of the integration and more specifically to test clinical simulation prior to go live. And I can't stress how important that is. Going into a new unit with new technology, you really need to have a good simulation program. I'll talk a little bit about ours later. So how do we do this? Well, the most important thing in terms of starting is creating a good team. And this team, if you don't have buy-in from all of the different players, the project is not going to be successful. And this was really important. You need to have a multidisciplinary team. We've heard that before, but you also need to have leadership on the team. So you need to get hospital leadership and executive management on board. That's not something that's easy to do in the days of juggling priorities and budgets. You need to have the physicians involved, which in many units, they don't want to know what's going on with the monitor. They just want to come and do their job, and they feel that's nursing responsibility. Obviously, you need nursing and nursing administration to be on board. But there are other things. You need respiratory care because they're the ones who take care of the monitors. You need biomed clinical engineering. You need IT involved. And, of course, you need lawyers because there's the whole risk of, assessment and all of the contracts, and they end up being heavily involved, and that ends up being one of the most time-consuming parts of the process. So we built this team, and actually we were awarded last year in June the Rush Team of the Quarter, an award from the institution. And this is just a list of all of the people that were involved. And it's hard just to read from a distance, but we have physicians, nurses, we have respiratory therapists, we have all of risk management, we have a number of people from IS, clinical engineering, telecom, all of whom really pulled together in order to help get this project to work. So rather than reinventing the wheel, it's always helpful to talk to other people. And we talked extensively to other units. We talked initially to Texas Children's and Women and Infants of Rhode Island, who had both moved into single patient rooms, and about their middleware experiences. Later on, we talked to some of Connexall customers as well to get some more information. But we also talked to Draeger because Draeger was the monitor. You know, the hospital chose Draeger as the physiologic monitor. There aren't many units in the U.S. that are using Draeger, and so we really talked to them quite extensively about what their experience has been with middleware and what kind of partnerships that they have. We send out RFPs to 4 companies, and they're Connexall, AMCOM, Philips Emergent, and ASCOM, and I'm trying to really be, even though this conference is sponsored by Connexall, talk a little bit about the fact that there are other middleware providers that are out there. Connexall is the official middleware provider of Draeger, and they have collaborated quite extensively working on this particular interface that Draeger has, which is a Win API, and it's not by HL7, which I think the majority of the other systems use. And we were able to retrieve, it's able to retrieve the assignments from Nurse Call using this Roland Responder Sync. Roland is our Nurse Call system. It was compatible with most of the handsets that we could find, including the Cisco phones that we were already using that were entirely across our institution. And they have this interface for making soft keys so that you can respond and assign specific values to the various keys. They didn't have any interface with the ventilators, which was a real problem for us because we wanted to get alarms from the ventilators. And not only did they not have them, but certainly none of the other providers did, and they all needed to have a data aggregator. We did talk to AMCOM, which is a large middleware company, and they had really limited, if any, experience with the Draeger system that we were using. They did have a way to work with the Roland Nurse Call system. They had a great interface for Cisco phones, including be able to pull up the Active Directory, which is probably what we thought was the strongest point. But they also didn't have an interface to the ventilators and would have required a data aggregator. Philips Emergent, we talked to, although really they were not particularly helpful since we don't have any equipment that's made by Philips. And I think that if you're a Philips hospital, Emergent is probably a good solution. If you're not, if you don't have any Philips equipment, then they really had no way to interface with Draeger. They also had no way to interface their assignments with our Nurse Call system. And so it would have required dual sign-in, and our nurses weren't too excited about that. They were already unhappy to sign in the first place. They did have interface for the Cisco phones, and again, you needed a data aggregator. ASCOM also had no experience with Draeger or Roland. Unlike the other companies, they have their own phones, and so that's one little niche market that they do supply their own phones. and they also need a data aggregator. So we chose middleware from Connexol primarily because of this Draeger interface in terms of when you look at specific advantages. They had the best integration for nurse call. They were compatible with the handsets we already had, with the flexibility to change in the future, because that was something we didn't want to take on as part of this project. But we needed to deal with the data aggregator. So I'm going to go over this quickly. We had a Puritan Bennett 840 was the main vent that we were using, although we were trying to get rid of them and looking for other ventilators. They just came out with a new replacement with a much better neonatal ventilator. But like many pieces of equipment, there's serial ports in the back that you can theoretically stream the data out of. There are not a lot of, when they designed this vent, no one ever thought that this was going to be connected to any kind of data management system. It was really done so that if you were doing a research study or something, you could throw a laptop on there on the serial port. Serial technology is so old that you can't find a laptop anymore that has a serial port. So that's really not what the vents were designed for, but nonetheless, they do stream the data out of those serial ports. And then we talked about other things, smart pumps, oximeters, capnographs, and other technology, almost all of which have that same kind of serial port output. So we did a data aggregation RFP, and there are 3 companies. We talked to Capsule Tech and Move On that actually came to meet with us, and we talked on the phone to Iserona. And these companies all make drivers for all kinds of equipment that they can hook up, capture that data that streams out of the serial port, and then stream it through to whatever type of middleware that you want. And they can also stream it directly to your electronic medical record for charting and a lot of other things that they do. They don't do a particularly good job of sorting that information out and categorizing it so that they can put in parameters for delays and so on, the kinds of things that middleware do, but they do have some basic ability to send the information directly to phones. And each of these companies have hundreds of drivers of the pieces of equipment that they deal with. Many of them are things that the actual companies that make the equipment don't even know that they've developed drivers for or haven't worked together. For example, we have smart pumps that are made by CareFusion, and those smart pumps, CareFusion does not allow third parties to connect to their systems. So they don't publish those drivers, they don't release the information. And what these guys do is they just go and plug a serial port in the back and play with the device and see what data streams out and then come up with their own drivers that they make independently. And so several of them could provide drivers for the smart pump. We ended up going with Covidian, who is the manufacturer of those ventilators, that they came out with a new data aggregator of their own. And the primary reason we did that was because of the fact that they had a great ventilator management tool that our respiratory therapists wanted to use. And this is called VitalSync, and it allows them to manage the entire fleet of ventilators remotely on a tablet. That they get, not only do they get all the alarms directly on the tablet just through that Covidian software, but they can see all of their ventilators at the same time, and they can look at waveforms and really everything that's on the screen of the vent they can see through the software. And that's why they were particularly keen to get this, and of course it streams the data to Connexol. We were the first center that used this system, and so they really gave us quite a good deal. They're low front-end costs, and instead of charging by license and setup fee, they just said, okay, we'll give it to you at a very low cost, and you pay every day that a patient is on the vent using the system, you pay a daily fee. And that's how the costs are covered.
The respiratory therapists in your hospital have a central location where they can see all the ventilators at this point?
So the respiratory therapy in the NICU, because the NICU is the only place this is set up, they have it on a tablet, so it's not a central place. They bring it with them. They walk around with a little Windows tablet that they have, and it's an interface that runs only on Windows, but they bought those Windows Surface tablets that are nice little devices, and they just carry one around with them. They have a mobile cart that it can sit on, or they just carry it in their hand, and they have a screen where they can monitor all of the ventilators, like little tiles that form on the screen, and each one is an individual ventilator with their room and identifiers, and they can touch on the tile, and it blows up to the whole. Then the whole window is that particular vent. They can see the pressure volume curves. They can look at and live streaming data directly from the ventilator.
Thank you.
And it's a pretty impressive system, far more than just data aggregation for alarms. And really, that's why we picked that. And we thought that if we're going to go hospital-wide later, we may end up needing to get a real data aggregator to use across the house. Especially also, we'd like to get our monitor data to sync directly with Epic, and that's something that this system can't do. So we'll probably talk about that more. All right, so for handsets, we looked around at handsets. As I said, we are using those Cisco 7925 phones that it looks like my Nokia phone from 1998. And it's very limited screen capability. We have heard rumors that they're going to be discontinued at some point, but we don't know anything really about that. Ascon has their own handsets, and as you know, Volt we originally thought these were jailbroken iPhones, but actually they're not. When I made this, that was actually what our impression was. And Volt has now, they're moving away from the iPhone because the problem with Apple is that Apple doesn't let you make your own hardware or software, and so they had to deal with the phone that they built a little sled around. And many of you are using the Volt, and there are a number of new phones that are coming on the market, including one that we are developing as well. So this is the architecture of our implementation, and this is kind of a busy slide, but it shows you that these are all the inputs and outputs. And the Connexall system is this dual server system, and then all of these various devices input into them. So just to simplify it, here's one showing Connexall as a single server, and these are the various systems on the outside. So we have Epic is the source of the AEP that streams that data in. Then we have Draeger that sends all of the alarm data from the physical monitors. We have Roland, which is the responder synchronous call system that has a dual system that's sending two separate channels. So one is a TCP/IP connection that is sending the assignments through the SYNC, as well as it has a serial port that we have a serial to IP converter to get the actual alarm information. And then we have up here, we have the Covidian aggregator, which is the server that runs their system that also feeds the data through. It also communicates with the call manager, so every time that there's a message that goes out, it goes directly to the phone, but authenticates through the Cisco call manager. And then we also have a SQL server here that is collecting all of the reporting data, so all the alarms get stored in there so that you can go back and collect the data. So this is just to kind of review. The inputs are the Roland, Draeger, the Covidian system, Epic, and the Cisco call manager, and the outputs are the Cisco voice over IP phones and the SQL server. So just looking at how those connections work, we use Nurse Call for a number of different things. The most important one is all of our code blues run through that. And as I said before, without middleware, Roland just sends a phone call to your phone, and it rings, and that's what you have to do, and that's the same sound as for a patient asking for a drink of water. We didn't want to have it that way, so we set up specific alarms, and we did this direct communication. Instead of using the SIP protocol, we ended up, let's go to the next one, we routed all of them through the middleware so we had, they come as text messages. And the advantage of doing that is even the ones that are calls, they send a text message to the phone, and when you hit answer on the phone, it actually originates a call from the phone back to the origin. So the benefit of doing that is you can send that text message out to multiple people, and whoever answers first is the one who makes the phone call back. You can't do that with a SIP client. You can't make multiple phone calls from the same source. And so the other advantage is that we could have specific ringtones, and this was something that we thought was really important for alarm fatigue. We didn't want to have people confused by the sounds, and so we spent a lot of time working on what the ringtones should sound like. The code blues, actually the policy in our hospital is code blues are supposed to be announced on the overhead, where they have to say code blue 3 times. So we created voice ringtones for the code blues because we wanted people to have to respond. And I always joke about this at the time, that I always wanted the phone to be able to deliver an electric shock to the person at the same time to get them to get up and go for a code blue. But it's been really helpful. At the time, people thought it was too loud, it was too annoying to hear a person's voice, because in our simulation, they thought it was very loud, but that's where we had multiple codes in a short period of time. In reality, we don't have codes very often, and so they really appreciate the fact that they hear a person's voice and they know they drop what they're doing. So, do you have a question?
Does your code blues go to the central and pays overhead to the whole hospital, or are they local?
So the rest of the hospital does code blue on the overhead. So you hear code blues going on in the entire institution. We've never used that model because our code blue team, we don't want to confuse. If we were to announce code blue in the NICU, all the adult ICU code team would show up. And occasionally we do call it real code, like a mother will faint or something will happen, and we have a visitor who passes out. We once had a guy who stopped breathing because he was shooting heroin in the bathroom of the mom's room. So, these are the kinds of weird things that will happen, and those result in a code blue where those people come. We don't do it on the overhead. We only do it through our own internal system. So, as I mentioned before, the soft keys can allow the cancellation, escalation, and there are different ways to do this, and this is the TAP protocol. And the assignments are entered in the nurse call system, and then they sync directly with ConnectCall. And that way you don't have to sign into two systems. So the Draeger also speeds all of this data through for the alarms and for critical values. You can put up to 64 monitors on each gateway, and each gateway needs an independent interface. So the nice thing here is that the severity of the alarms and the escalation all can be defined. Epic is our master repository for ADT data, and so that's automatically ported through to ConnectCall, and then there are these data aggregators that we use for other things. I mentioned already about this VitalSync. The way it works is we bolted serial to Wi-Fi adapters on the back of the ventilators, and so they send the information over Wi-Fi, and it streams to the Covidien server and then goes to ConnectCall using HL7. The Cisco phones, I'm not going to talk too much about. I don't think anyone out there is looking to purchase Cisco phones these days. But just a little bit about, the nice thing about the phones was that we were able to customize the ringtones, as I said before, and we took the sound. So Draeger has 3 levels of acuity in terms of the sounds. They have what they call the red, yellow, and advisory alerts. And we got the ringtones directly from Draeger as well as from Covidien for the ventilators. So that, and then we clipped them down so that they weren't very long, and we made the phones make the same sound that the devices make at the bedside. And we thought that was really useful, especially to all of the respiratory therapy sounds. They're so used to the noises the vents make, we didn't want to introduce confusion. I think anyone who's going through to do this really should think about ringtones and how that works, because someone made a comment yesterday how if you go and make all of the sounds that the phone makes to various people and ask them what does that mean, many people don't know. In our unit, they know what the sounds are because we specifically chose sounds. And John spent a long time, one of our nurses, working on sounds for, so like what happens if there's a delivery and different types of delivery and there's a new admission to the room, or staff assist. So we came up with customized sounds so that every type of alarm had a different sound. And some of them are quiet and pleasing, and others are louder and annoying, depending on how fast we want people to respond. Okay, the reporting server is just a SQL server that logs all of the data. There needs to be data retention that should be consistent with policies, and we argued for a long time whether this should be 7 or 21 years, depending on whether you need to follow just normal hospital policy or until babies reach age of majority. And we budgeted for 7 years and figured that we'll figure it out in 7 years from now. And these can be queried using reporting tools such as Crystal Reports or Access or SSRS. And ConnectCall has a bunch of tools that they actually have pre-configured reports that you can generate. So the design is, the design of the middleware was that we brought in all of these alerts from different places. So we had 13 monitor alerts from Draeger. We had 48 Covidien alerts. Here we really went overboard. We looked at the manual and we figured out how many alerts how many alarms can the ventilator make. We should capture them all. And this is something, it seemed, some of them were vent failure alarms and things like that we wanted people to know about. And then Roland, we created 41 nurse call alerts. And this is complicated because there's not just our unit where there's code blue, there's timers on there where, if you do something and you have to come back and reassess the patient in 60 minutes, you can just tap this button on the panel that sends you, it's a timer. After 60 minutes, it sends you a reminder so that if you need to, you do a feeding and you have to measure glucose after 30 minutes, you can set that up and it sends the alert directly to your phone. Then in the delivery room, we have levels of delivery, what we call level 1, 2, and 3, depending on the severity and who's supposed to come. And for each of those, we needed to know if it were twins, because if it's twins, we send 2 teams, and then if it's a premature baby. So we set up a lot of different alerts through Roland and to let us know exactly what it is so you get as much information. And these were the labor and delivery alerts. Then the mother-baby unit was really just code blue and staff assist. And then we added what we call system alerts, and this is critically important. It's important to know what your system is, how your system is working. When I showed you that big diagram with ConnectAll at the center, we didn't know when we built the system. We thought, oh, we have to just configure ConnectAll to connect to all of these various systems. We didn't know that none of them were working properly, and that our Roll and Nurse Call system was crashing and rebooting every day, and because nobody was monitoring those things. And with the help of ConnectAll, we added what they call heartbeat functions. So all of these servers have a little utility that just pings ConnectAll either every 30 seconds to once every 2 minutes. And as soon as ConnectAll doesn't hear from those things anymore, it says, wow, there's something wrong, and sends alerts to the appropriate people either by text message, email, and we have a whole working group that gets those system alarms. So we now have 29 system monitoring alerts. Not very long, so not more than a minute or two. I mean, enough that, like the 30-second ones, I think we put them at 90 seconds, so if it missed it twice, then by the third time it would hit it. And I think the 2-minute alarm, some of them we did that were longer, but not for very much time, because the problem with our system is that the Roland goes down and comes back up all the time. This is what was happening. It doesn't anymore because we were able to identify, but you know, we moved into the NICU 2 years after the rest of the tower moved in, of the new building, because they had to rebuild later in the whole area where postpartum and antepartum were before we could go in after those people moved into our tower. So, you know, during that time, we were able to really figure out that we had a lot of difficulty with that. Like there was a disconnect between these various units. So, sorry, can you just repeat the last part of your question?
What I really wanted to know is the nurse can't really do a whole lot with that. Does the call go directly to like that Biomed or
so
somebody who
the
could
call
fix
goes
it?
To Biomed, it comes to me and John, it comes to the charge nurse, and it goes to actually people within ConnectAll, even to let them know, depending on if it's a ConnectAll server issue, it goes to them. If it's Covidian is down, it sends an email to the reps from Covidian to their tech support. And so, as I mentioned before about Roland was going down all the time, and it would come back up right away. So you really need to set those parameters for a very short time, because if you set it for 10 minutes, you don't want to know the system's down 10 minutes before it comes back up, because it only has to be down 1 minute and you miss it for blue. So with that previous system, we used to hear from these other people in the other parts of the hospital that they would press a code blue and it wouldn't go anywhere, the phone wouldn't go to the phones, and they would put in a ticket and they would do something, they would file a UO, and by the time someone came to review it, 6 hours later, the system was working fine. Even 10 minutes later, they would come and press again, it was working fine. And so people shrugged their shoulders and thought, am I just crazy? What happened? Did I not press the button down hard enough? And we used to hear about this all the time, and the reality, yeah, it was going down because the services were, even the server didn't crash, but various services would crash and then restart again. And unless you're monitoring those tightly, you don't have any way to know. And I think this is, maybe a unique problem for us because our IT department wasn't adequately monitoring their own servers. But I think this is a common problem. The way this relationship works is that, like for Nurse Call, IS doesn't have anything to do with it. It's actually run by not even clinical engineering, but medical center engineering. So they're the same people who fix the heating and air conditioning and do the wiring. And the way the contract works is that IT sets up the servers, configures them, and then just says, here you go, here's the IP address, and the login. You log in, load your software on, and you own it now. And the vendors are supposed to own it. And the IT department didn't monitor to see if those servers were working or not. They're opposed to, as well, if it stops working, someone will let us know, and we'll investigate. So this system alert is something that I think is a really important process to do right at the beginning and not learn the hard way the way we did, that you have a problem only after you're getting close to the time that you want to go live. All right, so this is a graph of just some of the call stops that we set up, and I know this is very busy, so I'm just going to blow up this upper corner here, and this is to give you an idea of, so you can set up the DSAT. These first three are the highest priority, and Draeger has an additional functionality on top of the regular upper and lower SAT limits that you can set what's called a critical DSAT that is at 10% lower than the lower limit. And the nice advantage of that is that you can If the patient drops 10% below the lower limit, then you can change the priority. So if you have a big delay on your lower sat limit, by the time it gets down to 10% below it, then it can go instantaneous. And so we set these up, and there are all these different parameters that you can set. This is for one of the nurse call systems, and we set all of those up as well. And then before we moved in, we went through a pretty rigorous simulation-based training process. And we wanted to simulate a bunch of scenarios that were typical of what we do in our unit. So how you do an admission, how you do a code blue, what happens when there are two babies that are having a crisis at the same time. What about a patient who's going to the OR and the anesthesia is coming to get not weird things that hardly ever happen, but common everyday workflows where we could try to identify what was going on. And so we needed to look at clinical decision making, how teamwork worked, interprofessional team training. And this program we used was a program that was developed by the Women Infant Hospital in Rhode Island. And the name of it is Test Pilot, which you can see what the acronym is here. I think they just chose words to make it come together as Test Pilot. And it was originally developed there in the emergency department and then ported into the NICU, and we worked together with them to develop these. It's an in situ simulation program with cameras and audio so that you can do these various scenarios, everything is recorded, and then you can go back and do kind of a debriefing afterwards. And it's to evaluate new and existing systems and workflows, and specifically to identify latent safety threats. And so with each debriefing, all of the participants were asked, okay, let's go through in these various categories. Tell me all of the problems that you discovered. What are your concerns? And people would talk about all kinds of different things. And one of the examples when we first met with them to develop this program they gave was when they first moved into their new unit in Providence, one of the first things they discovered when they did their very first test pilot was they had a code blue in the room, and the person who called the code blue picked up the phone, dialed to the clerk that were having a code blue, and realized that she had no way of knowing what the room number was because they didn't put the room number on the inside of the room. They only put it on the outside. And this was an example they gave of a latent safety threat. So you're having a crisis in the room, you're calling someone saying, I need help, come, yet you don't actually know where to tell them where to go. And so this was the example that they gave. So this test pilot was a multidisciplinary team. We went through 8 clinical scenarios, and we did this over 10 rooms that we set up for simulation. And we did some 30-minute simulation with a 60-minute debriefing. So we had nurses, neonatologists, nurse practitioners, residents, respiratory therapists, really everybody involved. We even had pharmacists, x-ray techs, and the people we called confederates were a group of people that were basically there as wild cards to kind of throw into the mix. So they were simulated parents who would then start screaming, what are you doing with my baby? Or some other crisis that's going on. We had transport people coming in saying, hey, I'm here to take this baby to the OR who it's the wrong patient. And so they were really there to just try to throw a wrench into the simulation that nobody knew who was actually participating in what they were going to do. And so we identified latent safety threats that we split into these various categories. And you can see that the largest one is communication. And this is always a big latent safety threat. And this data is just about to get published. But also other things, equipment, ergonomics, systems, workflow, facilities, family center care, and environmental safety. And so you can see really there's a lot when you just look at communication and systems workflow that are in the blue and purple. Between the two of them, those are almost 50% of the latent safety threats. And these are things that are greatly impacted by alarm management. All right, so just to look a little bit at our results, we did this last fall where we did a tabulation from March through September, and we had almost 7 months worth of data that I broke down here by alarm type and by month. And you can see the total. We had 1.1 million alarms during that period for one single unit. And it sounds like a lot. I heard yesterday from someone who's here from University of Michigan. They have a million alarms a month across their hospital. This is just in one unit. And when you look at the actual numbers, you can see overwhelmingly the majority, in this case half of them, were the low saturation, and then that critical DSAT is also another 230,000. So between those two, it accounts for almost 3/4 of the alarms. And this is one of the big frustrations. The high saturation also is pretty high. So when you take all of the saturations away, the numbers go down dramatically. So this is what those look like if you plot them by month, and September was a particularly high acuity month, and March was only part of the month. So if you look at also alarm duration, how long do these alarms last? And because that's also an important factor, the total is 18 million seconds. So if you work that out, that's about 7 months. So what that means is in our 7 months of continuous alarm, over a 7-month period, so it means on average in our unit, one patient was alarming at any given time. And that means there are a lot of alarms going on. If you walk down the hallway, that's why you hear alarms, because there are alarms going a lot of the time. So a 1.1 million is a lot, but if you break it down to per patient per day, it comes to 128 alarms per patient per day. And you've been hearing from the other units where they can be in the hundreds, even up to 600 or 700 alarms per day we heard about. And this is per patient, so if you have a 2 or 3 patient assignment as a nurse, you could end up with easily 300, 400, 500 alarms. And you can see again, the majority of those, this is per patient per day. Almost all of them are the saturation alarms. Brady's was an average of 3, apnea is 3. These are almost all false alarms. And this is another big problem, that many of these alarms are actually false alarms. And the leads off is also a number of annoying alarms. So if you look at by patient per patient per day, you can see that it did go up and up. Our acuity did go up during that time as well. But this is the average. This is the average over time was 128. But there's a lot of variability from patient to patient. And this is a Connexol report called a heat map, and I stripped off all of the patient identifiers and room numbers. But just to kind of show you that when you look at the variability, we had a set of twins that were just desaturating almost nonstop during that time. And it's hard to see the numbers, but this is 18,000 and 22,000 alarms just from those babies over a month, as opposed to other patients where, look, here's one with 200. So you go from 200 to 22,000, and you can imagine that alarm fatigue is, even though you can look at what your average is, there are individual patients who may be causing dramatic alarm fatigue, even though the average for your unit is not very high. All right, so alarm fatigue. So staff quickly complain of alarm overload, much like you just heard in the last presentation. And so one of the things we did was shortly after we went live and kind of caught our breath was we formed a group to look at alarm fatigue. And we surveyed the staff. We did some online meetings so people at various shifts could participate even if they were home. And we created a list of concerns that we divided into various categories, much like what was done in Test Pilot. And we came up with these lists, and here are some examples. So we wanted to decrease the volume at the central stations, and you just heard a lot about central stations. I think the overwhelming majority of us think that central stations, for the most part, are a waste of time. If nobody sits there and the alarm's ringing all the time, then why is it useful to have it? Yeah, someone pointed out there's some other uses. You can go and look back at data. You can look at waveforms. If you have a code, you can go back and look at things. But in terms of real-time utility of having alarms alarming at the central station, I think most of the time it just adds to confusion and noise in the unit. So this is a question of how to get away from it. So at least we decided, well, let's not have them so loud so that they're actually bothering people. And John went around with our biomed people with a sound meter and actually measured the decibel level, and we turned them down to what we thought was a reasonable level. The other thing we did was we noticed that all of these, what we call the yellow alarms, the high and low saturation alarms that are not the highest acuity, are really not actionable alarms, and people weren't doing anything about them. They would acknowledge it on their phone, or they would walk back over. The nice thing about the Drager monitor is there is that second level where if you drop another 10% below, you'll get a critical alarm. And so people weren't responding at all to the yellow alarms. So we thought, if nobody's responding to them, why bother having them go to the phone? And we just blocked those. Things about the volume on the phone. So we didn't want people to be able to turn the volume on the phone down. So we set the Cisco phone goes from 0 to 7 in terms of the volume settings, and we originally set it that you could only go from 3 up because we didn't want people to be able to ever turn the volume of their phones off. Even 3 is pretty loud if you're in a meeting or you're doing something. So they wanted to turn it down a little bit more, so we set it down to 2. There were some issues about the vibrate mode, which is annoying when you're on a phone call and your phone vibrates. So we talked about the sign-in process and how that could be worked. We looked at, all of these various things and the auto-escalation pattern, and we came up with what was here. This is the alarms per month per day generated at the bedside. After it was in May, at the end of May, that we made these changes. And so if you look at that, all of the alarms that are going to the phone, those are the ones that we stripped out. And so after May, the number of alarms to the phones went down dramatically to an average of less than 60 alarms per patient per day. So we cut the alarm transmission in half. All right, so what are some of the results that we had that were not our goals? We found that the nurse call system, as I mentioned before, was very unstable. And this is something I would recommend to anyone before you have ConnectSol come in and you set up all your parameters, find out what your system's doing, get them to install this little heartbeat functionality so that you know whether the rest of your systems are stable. And maybe you'll have a great idea. I met with a number of IT people yesterday who I wish we had at Rush too, who are really proactive, who seem to take ownership of these systems that really are the vendor software, and maybe in your institution you don't have that problem. The assignment thing from Rollin was difficult. We were the first installation of this product. We lost quite a bit of time getting it to work. And so that was a little bit of a drawback, but that's all been resolved now. And that was really with the help of ConnectSol to get that working. Rollin wasn't willing to help us at all. The Draeger monitors themselves have some major drawbacks. They're kind of poorly configured for newborn care. I think that when I look at the monitor overall, it's not the greatest monitor for newborns, and there are many false alarms that are generated, but as I talk more and more to people who are using other monitors, they all seem to have these drawbacks. And the ability to measure the respiratory activity of a baby is very, very poor because it's measuring the electrical impedance across the chest, and those leads are so small on a tiny baby that the babies can be breathing very shallowly, and it doesn't pick up anything and thinks there's an apnea, so you turn up the sensitivity, and then it becomes so sensitive that just the pulsatile activity of the heartbeat on the chest, because especially if a baby has a TDA, they get this active precordium, and that movement actually, the monitor thinks is a respiratory rate, so the baby can be apneic, but it thinks that their respiratory rate is 150 because that's what their heart rate is, and then it kind of slowly goes down, and it's only when they're Brady that you actually know that their heart rate is low. So this is a problem with all types of monitoring. All right, so just in conclusion, our conclusions were that the transition from open bay to single patient room ICU environment can be successful with an alarm management strategy, and that you can create virtual line of sight, and alarm fatigue can be successfully reduced. In order to do that, you really need a comprehensive multidisciplinary team. You need to make sure all your existing systems are stable, and you need to really focus on a great simulation program to identify problems before you actually start putting them on patients. So what is there for the future? I mentioned before about a comprehensive data aggregation system. We are probably going to start over the next few months looking at a way to directly populate EPIC, which is our EMR, with other data, starting with Draeger, because that's really the most useful, but also the ventilators. The respiratory therapists spend a good part of their day walking around the unit and typing something from one screen into another screen, which is really a waste of time. And so we're looking for ways to auto-populate all of that data. I mentioned before about the various drivers. We're really looking for smart pump alarms, especially because many of those are problems, especially if you have a vasoactive drip and the pump is occluded. You need to know, because that's a patient that could suffer harm. A lot of those alarms are things like, oh, the med's finished. Yeah, give an antibiotic. Really, does it matter if you know or not? Probably not. If it's sat for another hour, it wouldn't make any difference. So there needs to be that same kind of ability to differentiate the types of alarms the pumps make so that you know what are the important ones and what are the ones that are not important. The handsets, I mentioned also, the Cisco phones are very old technology, and it could be a whole discussion about handsets. Okay.
Couple minutes for questions. Anybody have any questions for Dr. Powell?
I have two. The first one is you said something that's about to be published. So
Yeah.
can you speak to that?
One of my colleagues, Beverly Robin, was the one who led that test pilot project, and she is in the process I don't actually have all the details, but that's her name, Beverly Robin, and she's at Rush, and she's the lead author, and she's presented at a couple of conferences. And she's worked together with someone in Rhode Island and someone else here in Florida. I don't know a lot of the details about the other people that she contacted. She really ran that whole simulation project. But if you want to email me, I can get you all the contact information.
And then the other thing is kind of an observation. You used words like serial driver and
Serial
HL7
port, yeah.
and wireless and other
Yeah.
cool words, and normally not associated with a neonatologist lexicon. And so I'm just curious how you feel about that, and what I can take back to the neonatologists that I work with.
So, I think one of the things that made our project really successful was that John Overby, who's one of our nurses, who's here with me, and I really, I think, are quite interested in technology and how technology works just on our own. And so that really made the project successful, because one of the biggest difficulties in this kind of project is you have the clinicians on one side who take care of the patients, so nurses, physicians, respiratory therapists, and so on. And they don't really care. They look at how things work. They look at the monitor and they see those numbers and they see it come through their phone. And how it gets there, really, it could be like from fairy dust sprinkling across, or it goes through the hospital network and they don't know how the technology works. And then you have the IT people who can, they'll put together whatever project you want, they'll take care of all of the equipment, but they have no idea what we do at the bedside. And that was a real problem with there was a disconnect between those two. And it's really helpful to have someone either from the IT side who has a great understanding of clinical care, or someone from the clinical side, which in our case, who has a much better understanding of IT, because we would sit in these meetings between the various vendors, because we had weekly meetings where we got all of these vendors together and we talked to them on the phone, and we would come up with the solutions of telling them, okay, this is how you're going to solve this problem, and workarounds for different things that we came up with that our IT people couldn't figure out how to do, because they really didn't know what we do at the bedside, and our clinical people didn't know how to do because they don't really know how the system works. And so, yeah, it is helpful to have someone who can bridge that disconnect between the clinical and technical people.
I just had a follow-up observation from that, and I, being an IT project manager myself, I'm seeing that same disconnect. From speaking with other institutions, I've seen this role of a clinical informaticist being that glue or liaison between the two worlds.
So,
I've seen that's very useful.
Right. So, in fact, that's exactly what we've done. And one of the things that happened as a result of this was we identified there are a lot of problems with the organizational structure of our IT department. And, I sat down with our chief of operations of our hospital back in the spring as we were getting through some of these problems, and really identified the fact that there's a huge lack of accountability between IT and the clinical service. And I see the role of IT at any hospital is to support clinical care at the bedside. And that's what they do. That's what everyone is there to do. That's what the hospital provides, clinical care. Yeah, at Rush we have the university, so they provide educational support and research and all of those other things. But really, Rush's primary business is patient care. And if IT is not supporting that, then they're not doing their job. There was no way to be able to tell whether they were doing a good job or not, because IT would come up with all of these various solutions and things that they would roll out, and they didn't know what's important for the clinicians. And the clinicians would want to have these projects they didn't technically know how to do, and so there was a real disconnect that happened. So one of the things that happened was that I got our IT department to create a part-time position for me as the medical director for technology integration for the hospital. And then we hired a person who comes from a nursing and informatics background, who's Sheila, who's also here, Sheila Whalen, who was the person who would then be that role as that bridge as a clinician informatics expert.
Follow-up question about the nurse call assignments or the assignments. What was the rationale for doing it in Rowland versus Connexall?
So that's an interesting question. Probably the biggest reason was that the rest of our house doesn't have middleware, so they already have an established workflow for signing in every shift into Rowland to do their nursing assignments. And some of our nurses don't just work in the NICU, they're like NICU, PICU, cross-trained nurses, and occasionally they would float from the mother-baby unit where they don't have middleware. So we didn't want it to be overly confusing. As we sat down when we first did the RFP and then we did the development, we were kind of assured that it didn't matter from a Connexall point of view, it didn't matter which one we did, because with this responder sync, in theory, it would just automatically sync from one to the other. Now, at the time, Responder was a one-way communication. So Responder was the publisher and Roland was the Connexall was the subscriber. And I don't know, am I allowed to talk about the future version and how that can potentially sync the other way? So the future version will allow it to sync the other way, that you could sign in Connexall and it will sync with Roland, so that would be a way around it. In retrospect, if we had known about the difficulty in getting the sync to work, we probably would have done it the other way. But I think now that it's working, it's easier to have one systematic way across the hospital. The interface for Roland is not a great one. And it's, for the first 5 or 6 months, every shift, at least one nurse would log in incorrectly or didn't do their assignment properly. And this is despite a 30-minute in-service that each of them were required to do to learn how to use Roland. So I always say that if you need a 30-minute in-service to learn how to use a web interface, then it's a terrible one, because I never had to learn how to use Gmail or buy something on Amazon or use any website. You can go to dozens and dozens of websites that we all use every day that no one taught us how to use without making mistakes. So why do you need to have a 30-minute in-service to log into Roland? And even still, we have these problems because the user interface is kind of cryptic, and I think it's not an easy one to use.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a question or a statement, but it's kind of to your point. So another part of what we do in the Office of Quality and Patient Safety is surveyor education. We have a director from the board to ask organizations more about physician engagement in patient safety and quality improvement. So as we design the education for surveyors, what we're looking at is carving out more time on survey for the surveyors to talk with physician leaders or frontline physicians. So as you think about this national patient safety goal or any, I would say it's extremely important that the physicians that are spoken to on survey know something about your policy.
Yeah.
They can speak to it. If they cannot speak to it, then that would likely be some feedback that the organization would get at the exit interview. I won't say that you'll necessarily be cited for RFI, but again, I emphasize that when the Joint Commission makes patient safety Chapter 1 in the manual, it's not just there for window dressing. So there will be a closer look at physician engagement in organizations around patient safety and quality improvement, specifically to national patient safety goals, because a national patient safety goal is what's called a direct finding. There are some indirect findings, but this one is a direct finding, all of them. So I would encourage you, as you start to roll out your policies, that there be a lot of attention paid to what we call licensed independent practitioner education.
One more?
Just to respond to what you said, getting physician buy-in and getting them to get involved is I have to say, is really hard. Of all of the clinical groups, getting physicians to be interested in what the alarms are doing is hard, because most of the time they don't want to know. They feel like the monitor that's all a nursing thing. They just want to take care of their patients and come in and leave. And it's really a problem with trainees as well, who would, we had this problem where they would be sitting at the central station, was making a lot of noise, and they were charting, so they just silenced the central station. And they don't want to know. They wouldn't come to any of the meetings to talk about it. Even still, one of the things we talked about yesterday was, why don't we have this rolled out to the rest of the hospital? Because all the adult ICUs would benefit from an extra level of safety. And the reason is because there's no physician leadership in the adult ICUs to say this is going to happen. In our unit, we have put our foot down, so we are not moving into this new unit until we feel confident that we can maintain safety. And we'll just stay where we are. And you can imagine the administration wasn't too thrilled about that. They didn't want to spend any money. They didn't want to do any of this. Their solution was, well, we have central stations, and we can take those ventilators, those PB840s, and plug them with a little phono cable into the auxiliary jack of the nurse call system, so there's a way so it can send a phone call to your phone if the alarm goes off on the ventilator, which means every single vent alarm from like on my the patient coughs and it triggers an alarm on the vent, and that results in a phone call on the phone, and also a disconnect. The tube becomes disconnected. That also results in the same phone call. So there was this real problem with a disconnect of priorities and safety, and it took a lot of push from our clinical, from me and our clinical director to make administration understand this was not a question of whether we're going to do it or not. We're not moving until this happens. In the adult ICUs, they're just I can't get them to, the physicians take it seriously, the nurses want to do it, but the nurses don't really know how to get this done on their own, and I think that that's one of the problems when it comes to what you mentioned before about you go through units and you talk to physicians, tell me about your alarm management policy, and most of them will look at you and say, what? I don't know what that is.
When we showed them their data, it was very easy to get the physicians engaged. When you show them their NICU data, that they have 22,000 pulse ox alarms a week, they're like, oh my gosh, what can we do? Same with our MICU or our CCU. The data speaks volumes, and I really believe that if you can show them something, that
Right.
they're analytic, and that's what they want to try to do is fix things, and they're more engaged with the data.
Take a break. Thank you, Dr. Powell.